An interesting piece of reading you might all enjoy is a book on Amazon called Tax Me, I'm Canadian. This is something that I feel that as a group, as a country, we are far too lenient on the government to accept new taxes, new restrictions on us, and we somehow think that's virtuous, that, well, there's another tax, so let's pay it. So I think it's time for us to take a look at some of these taxes and say, A, are they working, and B, should they even be there? So the speculation and vacancy tax, I'll just do a quick overview versus the empty homes tax, which many of you are probably subject to both. Okay, so City of Vancouver's empty homes tax, it only applies to Vancouver. Spec tax applies all over BC in certain areas. In fact, Vancouver overlaps both. So the spec tax applies to the person. Okay, so they're going to go after the person if they don't make a declaration or they're not exempt. And the empty homes tax is going to be against the property. So it's two different kettles of fish. The empty homes tax is 1% tax on the assessed value. The spec tax is anywhere between 0.5% and 2%, depending on who you are. So the government, I mean, in a sense, sort of sold this spec tax to everyone on the basis that here's what we're going to do. We're going to target speculators who own residences in BC but don't pay taxes here. We're going to turn empty homes into good housing for people, and we're going to raise revenue that will directly support affordable housing. So is anybody against any of those things? No, of course not. So that's the way you justify the tax in the first place. Then you say, okay, so that's all sounds good. Now how are we going to actually implement this, and what effect are we going to have? So interestingly enough, we start with the idea that what's this tax called? It's called the speculation and vacancy tax. Okay, so do you know how many times the word speculator, speculation appears in the Act? Anybody? 0. That's right. They don't mention it. But it sounds good in the title. The title sounds like speculator. Everybody thinks that's bad, right? That's somebody jumping in, trying to take advantage of something and make a quick buck. So we have, for example, I have clients in Cole Harbour and some places in Vancouver. They've owned a property, say, in the Shaw Tower for 15 years. They come here in the summer from, say, Arizona or California, and they live here in the summer because it's too hot where they live, and they're speculators. Okay, so it just doesn't strike me as speculators. They own a place for 15 years. You save up, you buy a condo in Kelowna, because that's kind of, a vacation property. You don't rent it out all the time. You're a speculator. Okay, because the Act doesn't say it. You have to infer that you're a speculator if you own a second piece of property or you don't live in your property enough. So the idea that the government has basically sort of made it a bad thing to say I'm not fully occupying my property, which I bought with my money, and I'm paying the taxes on it, the insurance on it, the upkeep on it, but somehow I don't have control over my own property. And especially if I own a second one, that's even really bad, because then obviously I'm totally a speculator. So the idea is that both the City of Vancouver actually and the spec tax have sold people on this idea that, well, either you live there full time or you have to rent it out for at least 6 months. So we think, well, okay, first of all, who rents a property for 6 months? Anybody? Probably not. Someone's going to move in your place, they want to live there at least a year, sometimes longer. But the idea was sold to people on the basis, well, just 6 months, don't worry about it. However, last year they amended the Residential Tenancy Act, this same government, to make it very, very, very hard to terminate a tenancy after 6 months. Okay, so you either have to substantially renovate the place, move in yourself, or sell it. So it's very difficult to terminate a 6-month tenancy, but it's okay, you just have to rent your place for 6 months. So they didn't actually, either they did that on purpose or they were just overlooked this. So when I called the residential tenancy branch to raise that with them, they said, well, that's completely a different department, we have nothing to do with it, so we don't really care. So the bottom line is, no, you can't really rent your property for 6 months, that's rare, and if your tenant decides they don't want to move out after 6 months, too bad for you. You're going to keep renting it on a month-to-month basis. So that's very disingenuous to me when you sell the property, you sell the tax on some formula of 6 months, which is really very, very rare now that the tenant is going to rent for 6 months. The other thing that didn't seem to hit the news when this tax was brought out is that it's retroactive. Okay, so retroactive legislation is generally frowned upon. It's very bad. In fact, you as a citizen should be able to structure your affairs to take advantage of whatever is available to you to minimize or reduce your taxes. I mean, that's your right as a citizen. In this case, you had no opportunity because they brought the tax in at the end of the year and they made it retroactive to January 1, 2018. So it's very, very bad. Some clients of mine have been dinged $50,000, $70,000, $80,000. There's nothing they can do about it. Okay, so because they didn't know what the law was, the law didn't in fact exist. So I would suggest to you that if one of my clients wrote up a retroactive lease that didn't exist 6 or 8 or 10 months ago, they would go to jail. But unfortunately, there's no such law in Canada that says governments cannot introduce retroactive legislation. I think that's totally disingenuous, and that part of the legislation is for sure a tax grab, because they couldn't go back in time and rent their property or sell their property or move into their property because the tax didn't exist and they didn't know what the ramifications were. So, as I said, I get calls every few days for people who are looking for some way to deal with the tax. Some people are being forced into sell their properties. Some people are, you've probably read in the paper, some people are renting 4 or 5 rooms of their properties out to students for $1,000 a pop because they don't want to pay this gigantic tax. Had a lady phone me the other day, and this is an interesting case. She's a British Columbia resident, born here, lives here, works here, pays her taxes here, lives in her house 7 days a week with her kids, and she's paying the spec tax, and she lives in Vancouver. Does that seem fair? Okay, because she's a member of a satellite family. So they've defined a satellite family as a family where their gross income of the family, you're between the husband and the wife, you're paying more taxes outside of BC than you're paying, or outside of Canada than inside of Canada. So the husband works in the United States, he makes more money than her, she becomes a satellite family member and she has no exemption, so she's paying the tax, which is $5,000 a year on her property. So this is so disingenuous. This is a person who lives here, works here, part of the community, and even to make matters worse, her husband isn't even on the title. She's 100% on the title. So these are kinds of cases that we see come up lots, and they're different permutations and combinations. And I just look at it and I say, well, I think the people of BC have been, as I say, the first thing I mentioned, who would disagree with that? No one. But when you actually try to implement something that's quite complicated, you have to take your time and you have to research it and you have to review it many, many times. In this case, in my view, this tax was rushed into place and it wasn't well thought out, and I don't think it's going to particularly work. So they also talk about, this is going to generate some revenue, and as my friend here pointed out, yes, you might generate some revenue here and lose the revenue on the other side on the property transfer tax, but that's a separate issue. Here, the government was proposing that they're going to raise $200 million in revenue, and I think to myself, okay, $200 million, what does that build? Okay, really? That's assuming you use it for affordable housing. What is that, like 1 tower? And that's it. So the fact is, even if they raised all of that, it still wouldn't make a dent in the market, not in the housing market at all. And the fact of the matter is, ironically, they want to take about $40 million or so of that out of that $200 million. They want to raise that from Canadians and British Columbians. So the idea why they didn't simply exempt Canadians, exempt permanent residents from this tax entirely, made no sense to me. I mean, why would Canadians and why would British Columbia residents be paying this tax at all? Makes no sense to me. You don't treat your own people this way. This was the idea, was, well, we're going to punish all these foreign owners who are doing all this stuff and they have no connection to Canada. Well, why is the government including Canadians and permanent residents of Canada? Doesn't make sense. And the other thing is, whenever a government takes money from you, whether it's a carbon tax or a spec tax or an empty homes tax, if they don't earmark the money for what they say they're going to use it for, there's absolutely no guarantee they will use it for that. So the fact is, yes, even if they used it all, it wouldn't make a dent, But the fact is, there's no guarantee that they'll use it for this initiative, because they won't earmark it. At least I haven't read anything in any paper that I've read that says it's specifically earmarked and you can't use it for anything else. It's something we should be demanding from governments, that if they take our money for a particular purpose, it goes for that purpose. And if it doesn't, they get voted out of office. So these are just a small, like, tip of the iceberg things that we've run across on this spec tax that seems to either have no effect or minimal effect, and it seems to be just optics. And if you break it all down and say, well, we're going to take $200 million from people, some of it from British Columbians, some of it from foreign owners, beyond that, it doesn't seem to have, it's going to have any effect that you could measure. And so the fact is, should it be there? Should a tax that doesn't work and it's just more money that you're paying, should the tax remain? You know, I'm not a fan of government. I'm not a fan of taxes. I think we pay too much tax, and I think we have too much government. So I think I agree with Andrea. It's time to rein some of this stuff in, start going the other way. I think as Canadians, as I say, we're far too compliant. We're far too trusting of government that they're going to fix everything. And it seems to me that governments now, they want to fix everything with another tax. So I'm going to leave it at that, and we can take some questions later on. Thanks.